Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for another episode of STEM Girls Virtual. My name is Emily and I'm here on behalf of Cincinnati Museum Center. On this show, we talk about different careers in the STEM fields, those fields being science, technology, engineering, and math. Today we're going to be learning about a group of women who broke down barriers to enter the STEM field over 70 years ago. Today we have Debbie Anderson, daughter of Joseph Desch, who ran the United States Naval Computing Machine Laboratory in Dayton, Ohio during World War II, and they paved the way for code breaking in the US during World War II. Debbie, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here, Emily.
Wonderful. So can you tell us how you became interested in code breaking, and in fact, what is code breaking?
Well, I became interested in it about 30 years ago. My dad died in 1987, and he'd always said that after he died, I might learn about some secret work he'd done during World War II. Well, and my mother was dead. So after his death, I began trying to verify whether there even was a secret project. And it was very slow going for the first few years. There was only circumstantial evidence that something important happened. But then in 1995, the story was made declassified, which meant that it lost its top secret status and could be known by the general public. And volumes of papers were released to the National Archives, and I could start learning about it for the first time.
Oh, wow. So it was quite a journey to learn about what your dad was doing.
I'm still learning new things. It's still not completely unclassified, so little leaks out at a time.
A little bit. So what kind of code breaking was going on up in Dayton? Like, what kind of codes were they trying to break and why?
Well, there were codes and there were ciphers. World War II was a conflict between the Allies, who would be United States and Great Britain and many others, and the enemies of Germany, Japan, and Italy. And the Germans and the Japanese used two different systems. The Germans, perhaps you've heard of the Enigma code, which is really well known. Well, the Enigma code is really a cipher system. And a cipher is where you take a plain text message that you want to keep secret and change it letter by letter, exchange letters with numbers, other letters, or even symbols. And the Enigma code was a cipher like this. And it was, this whole process is called encryption, or hiding a message with something else. The Japanese use codes, and codes are a system of rules where you know one word is expressed by another word or a phrase or a symbol, but the entire word is replaced. And this is an example of the Morse code, where words are sent out by dots and dashes over the telegraph. And that's where codes are used for good. Where they cause a problem is when an enemy is encrypting their messages or encoding their messages and we can't tell what they're saying. Code books are involved, and code books are, the Japanese code books were large books with just thousands and thousands of words.
Oh, wow. It sounds really complicated.
Well, it was all just trying to keep things secret.
Right, understandable. So why was Dayton, Ohio chosen as a site for code breaking?
Well, this involved my dad. My dad had gotten hired at the National Cash Register Company, which was known as NCR. Dad called it the factory. But he was employed there in 1938. Now, the war started for the United States in 1941 at Pearl Harbor. But as early as 1938, the armed forces, the Army and Navy and so on, were looking for contractors to take defense contracts for equipment. As they were gearing up, they had a sense that war was coming and they were trying to prepare. Dad had just gotten hired, but his first job was National Cash Register, made cash registers and business machines. And technically he was hired just to work to add electric gewgaws to mechanical cash registers. But defense contracts started coming to him because he had invented a counting machine. This counting machine used tubes, vacuum tubes, and so it was electronic. And the lab where Dad worked and designed these things and built them was called the Electrical Research Lab at NCR. While he was making these advanced machines with technology that very, very few people in the whole world were using yet. Vacuum tubes were brand new as far as using them for counting or for communication. He got a reputation around the country for this machinery, and he started getting defense contracts for advanced counters. You could use counters when measuring artillery. You could use counters to do a number of things that the military needed, and it was fast and it was accurate. And the contracts got more and more difficult, and they got more and more of a good reputation. And finally, at the end of 1942, the Navy chose him for this code-breaking work.
Oh, wow. And such a local tie. Dayton's not far from Cincinnati, where I am. And that's amazing.
And Dad was German, and all the Germans came through Cincinnati.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's amazing. So who were these code breakers that understandably we might not know a lot about still, but we do know some of them. So who were they?
Well, codes and code breaking had been around since man started to communicate in writing. So there was a profession of code breaking that was mostly, I shouldn't say mostly, but could be just an occupation for the idle rich to play games with secret codes and disguised letters. But between World War I and II, the Navy and the Army had departments where people were professional code breakers and were trying to break the codes of both our enemies and our friends just for an advantage in world politics. So they were linguists who would be familiar with foreign languages. They were clerks. They were people who loved crossword puzzles. There were a number of quirky occupations that lent themselves to teams who worked on codes and ciphers. Then, during the press of the war, since most of these people were men, the armed forces decided they were frantic for more staff, but everybody was being drafted. Well, the Navy decided they would allow women to enlist in the Navy. This whole department was called the WWII, which is an acronym for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. And thousands and thousands, it got up finally to 85,000 girls during the war became WWIIs. And of that pool of women, there were college graduates, and there were mathematicians, there were linguists, just as the code-breaking profession needed these skills. The Navy also went out and recruited women from colleges, and they picked specific colleges and went in and offered advantageous packages to these women if they would drop their studies or leave their job and come to Washington and work for the waves.
Oh, wow. That had to be incredibly exciting, probably, for a young woman back in the 40s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I often wonder if I would have had the courage to do what, now some of these women were out on farms in odd, isolated locales, and they were so happy to have somewhere to go where they could earn money. But a lot of them, I imagine it was a difficult decision. You had to be brave, and I'm not sure I would have been brave enough.
Yeah, it's hard to put yourself in their shoes a little bit, but yeah, what a really great way to serve their country during the war. And again, they got to travel, it sounds like, and meet maybe other similar interests. And so yeah, their stories must be fascinating.
Oh, they're amazing women. And they got to have their own income, which gave them independence, which was really good. But most of the women that I talked to and that are in the book Code Girls volunteered to support the men in their family who had been into the armed forces. I don't want to say drafted because many volunteered, but their brothers, their uncles, their nephews were serving, and they wanted to volunteer to give their services too.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So do we know what their lives were like in Dayton? Maybe outside of the lab or in the lab? Do we know a little bit about that?
We know a lot because we had a reunion in 1995. Their existence had been kept secret by the Navy, so, because the whole location of Dayton, Ohio, it was such an out-of-the-way place for secret work that the Navy tried to keep it secret after the war. In fact, some of the girls had their records destroyed just to try to knock people off the trail. Our reunion in 1995 was the first time any of these women talked about their life in Dayton. And since they were in Dayton, the memories came flooding back. And we even had people show up at the reunion location who had known the girls during the war and had them over for dinner and tried to make their life a little easier. But the women I met all had a really good time. NCR, one of the advantages of the Navy coming to NCR was that NCR, or National Cash Register, had a large sales camp in the hills above where the factory was. And a sales camp was for their salesmen to come during the summer and learn the new sales campaigns and hone their sales skills. So there were 60 cabins and a dispensary and a commissary, and then later a dormitory for the winter. There was a swimming pool, there was a tennis court, there were hiking trails, there was a lagoon where they could canoe. It was just an incredible, well, it was much more comfortable than the girls in Washington had in large buildings and dormitories. They had their own cook, they had their own doctor. It was pretty good, with the provision that there was no heat in the cabins. There was running water and a toilet. There were 4 girls to each cabin, and the only way to get circulation was to throw open shutters and let out the screen. But when you have swimming pools and your own cook, right. there were things that made up for it. They had so much fun. They had variety shows. They went on trips. They had softball teams. yeah, they had softball diamond. They really, we heard happy memory after happy memory after happy memory from the girls during the reunion.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. And it sounds like this would have been a really high stress job. So then to be able to relax a
Yeah.
little bit. So there are a lot of things to, maybe help them clear their minds when they weren't working. So it sounds like a summer camp for adults, but they're also doing really important work.
Well, they did have curfews, which were, I think, 9 o'clock at night. They had to be in their cabins.
Okay, Debbie. So after the war ended, do we know what happened to the lab and those men and women who were there? Do we know if the skills they learned could be used in different lines of work?
I think it changed everybody I spoke with. Now, it wasn't universal. We met about 80 of a group of about 600 women who passed through Dayton. And there were some unhappy people over the years, but first of all, they split into different groups. At the end of the war, a lot of the women had been transferred to Washington once they had their skills, and chose to make a career with the Navy, or at least chose not to leave the Navy at the end of the war. And so some women stayed there and worked in the Navy code breaking department for the length of their time. Some, the actual work in Dayton was transferred to a company in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And a handful of the women who had been at Sugar Camp all through the war and not gone to Washington went up to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and worked for a while. Some of the girls decided to go on to college, that they had liked having responsibility, or they were curious about what they pretty well knew what they were doing, but not officially. A lot of them became very active either in their communities or in veterans organizations. We had one woman I was very close to who was the Oklahoma Veteran of the Year, the year we had our reunion. And she was so proud. But they got a new confidence that I don't think they would have gained without all that responsibility.
So could you tell us a little bit about the book? Well, not your book. Sorry, let me redo that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So.
I got it.
Okay. So Debbie, we talked about some questions ahead of time, but I realized we never brought up the book, Code Girls, which mentions Dayton. So that is kind of how we got connected, is through the book. But that's amazing that this book talking about code breaking mentions the work in Dayton too.
Well, Liza Mundy is the author, and she had started her research when she learned about this story through the National Archives. The first place she went to do her research was the National Security Agency, which has a department of historians. And she asked them about the story, and also went to the museum where the sole remaining machine is located, and met the librarian at the museum. And she gave Liza my phone number. And Liza called me out of the blue and asked me if she could meet me, that she had heard I had a large amount of material about the waves, plus their names and addresses. And she was going to write this book about the waves and code breaking in World War II. Well, Liza came to Dayton and spent 3 days here. I was the first one she saw, and I did my darndest to sell her on the sugar camp story. As it turned out, it's really a sub-chapter in the book, but it is mentioned, somewhat humorously, but it is mentioned. But I was fascinated talking to Liza, and it took her 3 days to get through all the materials I've saved over the years. It then involved my dad also. And from then, there she went across the country. But I was so impressed with her. And so she mentions me in the references. Also, Emily, I wanted to tell you, she wrote a young person's guide to the Code Girls. And it's finished, it's on the shelves, but it might be something for you to list.
Yes, okay, yeah, we will, in the description of the event, we will list the book Code Girls and also the companion guide for young adults.
Okay.
No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I had no idea that would be really great for some of our younger viewers. So Debbie, if anyone's interested in learning more about the role of the waves, do you have any resources you can recommend? I know you have a website.
I do. I have a website, and it's a way to find a lot more information. The URL is DaytonCodebreakers.org. And at that site, I have bibliographies of books you might want to read. I have links to really reputable websites that are loaded with information. But as far as the waves and sugar camp, I have a section called personnel. It's a major branch of my website. There's a technical section where they can read more about the machine and the history of it. But for the waves and the sailors who were in Dayton, I have their personnel information. I have 2 rosters. I have all of their ID images from their jobs at NCR. I have oral histories. When they were in Dayton in 1995 and 2001, we did oral histories, and those are posted there. And I have some background information on Nebraska Avenue, where they were shipped, or on Sugar Camp. I have a lot of personal photos that the waves shared with me too. So. Okay,
and we'll include the link to your website with the event so people can really easily find it. No, that sounds great. I've been on your website. It's really easy to get around and find what you're looking for.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll share that too for anyone who's interested in learning more about code breaking and more the history of up in Dayton during the war. So yeah, we can do that. And lastly, Debbie, I just have one more question for you is, as you've looked in the past at women who are doing all this groundbreaking work, and now we're looking towards the future of women in careers in the STEM fields, do you have any hopes for what these future women in STEM might accomplish?
Oh, I have hope and confidence. I think a new day, the whole STEM world is being open to women. One thing I learned about the waves by talking to them is most of them had no idea that they had the capability that they had and showed during the war. They didn't know some of them had aptitudes for mathematics or languages. They didn't know they were good in managerial positions. And they had a chance to grow into these roles and learn more about themselves. So now they're kind of an inspiration. And I know in meeting them and meeting more women who work at the National Security Agency, I really wished I could go back to 1968 and remake some decisions. and follow what I really had an aptitude for. But I didn't have the confidence, and it was still a man's laboratory at that time.
Yeah.
So the waves should be, they were an inspiration to me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think sometimes when we're talking about STEM, we're always talking about the future, but it's nice to take a moment and look back and see what was happening again 70 plus years ago, and learn from those women as well. So thank you very much for joining us today, Debbie. This was a really great chat. This was great.
Oh, thank you, Emily.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you for watching, everyone, and we'll see you next time.